So welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to have you here for tonight's lecture. It's a part of the Tough Talks lecture series. For those who are new or come sporadically to the series, this is a student-run lecture series where the students select and invite the guests. And the goal is to bring smart, thoughtful, and provocative speakers who often represent viewpoints that are not the majority viewpoints on campus. That can be from the left, the right, the outer space, or we've had all sorts of different kind of speakers, but to bring people who are going to push us to think differently and creatively, and often against our own convictions at Bard. And I don't want to sell Bard short. There's a lot of different convictions at Bard. It's not a monoculture. And I think the fact that the students have embraced the Tough Talks lecture series and really enjoy hearing from perspectives that challenge their own is a testament to the college and what we're doing. And the Arendt Center is thrilled to support it. Since it is a student-run series, I'm going to hand it off to one of our Hannah Arendt student fellows, Charlotte Geisler, who's a senior at Bard and studying global international studies, and let her take over and introduce tonight's speaker. Charlotte.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm taking over for Rosie Levy today, who is in charge of the Tough Talks series. So this is her introduction. The Tough Talks lecture series is an initiative for our community to critically consider controversial ideas so as to better hold accountable our own thinking. We want to invite Nick Gillespie to participate in the Tough Talks series because of how his work challenges the dominant political binary in the US and pushes us to reevaluate the ways we communicate with each other, especially how we disagree. Nick Gillespie is an editor-at-large of the libertarian magazine Reason, where he hosts the Reason Interview, a weekly podcast that explores what comes next in politics, culture, and libertarian ideas. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. And he has served as a commentator on many television and radio programs from NPR, C-SPAN, MSNBC to PBS. Today, his talk, How the Pandemic Killed Freedom, Individualism, and Free Speech, along with 500,000 Americans, will focus on how the political and cultural response to COVID-19 will long outlast the disease itself. It will discuss how the pandemic has accelerated and exacerbated trends that centralize economic and social power, increase the amounts of our lives subject to government regulation, and ushered in a new age of censorial behavior. And he will argue that we need to embrace libertarian ideals if we want a future that is open-ended, adventurous, and fun. And a fun fact about Nick is that he used to edit a teen magazine called Teen Machine. Now, please welcome Nick Gillespie.
Thank you very much, Charlotte and Roger and everybody for listening to me. What I'm going to do, hopefully, is run through some prepared remarks for maybe half an hour or so, and especially given that we have a relatively small group, I would love to be able to, have more of a wide-ranging conversation about stuff. With that, I guess I'll start my remarks. I realized only as I was getting closer to actually doing this that Tough Talks is, kind of polemical or more polemical. So I am going to, on the fly, try to become a little bit more polemical in the hopes of provoking, not necessarily, provoking a conversation or arguments about stuff. As Charlotte was kind of alluding to, for me, probably I consider myself a liberal in the kind of classical sense. And for me, the idea, and this is also, I guess, apropos of talking about anything with Hannah Arendt in the title or the setting or whatever, is the idea that we really need places where we can openly disagree with people and try out ideas, not necessarily to be antagonistic, but we get better arguments when we are kind of discussing things in public without irony or reservation or anything like that. So I guess the first thing that I want to say to people, and I also want to find my clock and set it. So let me do that. The first thing I want to congratulate everybody here, especially the undergrads. It looks like there's a wide variety of non-traditional undergrads, at least from what I can see. So I welcome all of you for continuing your lifelong learning and whatnot, but especially to the younger people in the audience, which I'll generously define as anybody younger than me. You're living through history. In the past year, 2.5 million people on the planet and over 500,000 Americans are dead, and there will be more to come, even as the coronavirus lockdown or pandemic comes to a close, or kind of fades down to a background level where a lot of people are talking it's going to become like a flu. It might be an annual event or whatever, but we have gone through one of the most intense and bizarre and disruptive years, certainly since World War II. And what I want to talk about is the long term implications of COVID 19, and especially the lockdowns that came in the wake of, just starting a year ago, on various aspects of our lives, of our daily lives, the quotidian details of things that we do, including how we live and work, and what comes next once the pandemic subsides. My comments fall essentially into two categories. One is, and on the one side, there are developments that I think are positive, either positive and actually good, or neutral from a kind of normative position or a moral position, and then those that I think are very bad and will have long-term negative implications for us. And then after I suss out kind of some of these things, then I want to talk about what I think we should consider to prevent or minimize the bad outcomes. And as Charlotte kind of alluded to, I want to, I'll explain where I'm coming from in a general way. If you're familiar with Reason Magazine at all, this is our latest issue, which has it's got a bunch of stories essentially about magic mushrooms and psychedelics. I contributed manifesto to why I think mushrooms should be legal. The reason for this was that mushrooms were legalized along with other drugs in Oregon, but why that's a good idea. But if you are familiar at all with Reason Magazine or myself, we're generally libertarian in outlook. The magazine's subtitle, it was started in 1968 as a monthly magazine. Our cover line is Free Minds and Free Markets, meaning that we place ourselves in the tradition of classical liberals, including people like Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, among others. For me personally, the way I think about being libertarian, one is I think of it as an adjective or as a direction or an impulse rather than an end state. I rarely say I am a libertarian. I'm more likely to say I'm libertarian, meaning that it's kind of a disposition or a temperament, a default setting, and a direction. But I believe in minimizing coercion and maximizing individual autonomy in all aspects of politics, culture, and ideas. I'm predisposed towards a profoundly limited government that mostly provides basic safety and social welfare, maybe a little national defense. And I'm in favor of generally free markets, freer markets, freer movements of people across borders, and the like. I'm not an anarchist, although libertarians are often confused and often confuse themselves for anarchists. And I do believe that there are legitimate roles for the government at all, at various levels. But I do think it works best when people are given maximal, I guess that's a big word in my vocabulary, maximal decision rights in their lives. The good society, I think, for me, is one where more people have more choices and understanding of their choices. But in that spirit, I would say something like, and this is just as background, if we're talking about something like welfare spending, I would prefer a system to the one we have now where we might give somebody a couple $100 a month on for food, a voucher for a housing, and a voucher for healthcare. I'd rather we just gave them money and let them decide how best to go about improving their lives or actualizing their lives, things like that. And probably most importantly, as I think I've alluded to, I believe in free speech and free expression, not just as legal rights, not something that inheres in a constitution or whatever, but as part of a broader culture that is emphatically pluralistic and tolerant, that is created to allow people to run what John Stuart Mill would call experiments in living to the greatest degree possible. There are times where we need to have a consensus and say certain things cannot be allowed or whatever, but that should be minimal, and we should be arguing and talking and agreeing and disagreeing with us more than we do. So on with the show. And I guess when it comes to COVID-19 and its effects, the first thing that I want to kind of underscore is that I don't think COVID-19 and the lockdowns really, and they're separate phenomenons, but they're obviously closely related. But I don't think that COVID-19 and the lockdowns have fundamentally changed the direction of society, however you want to define society, the direction of it, or qualify those terms. Events such as the pandemic tend to accelerate or decelerate a movement, I think, but they don't usually start us in a whole new direction for a variety of reasons. We like to assume, and this, particularly if you're into partisan politics, we like to assume that every couple of years, every 4 years, every 8 years, that suddenly something new and revolutionary is happening. I think there's a lot more continuity in our political and cultural lives, in our historical lives, than most of the time we want to admit. There's real positives to that. There's some sadness, I must say, but the first thing that I want to say is that turnabouts in our lives are much less common than our discourse or our rhetoric suggests. And so, for the older people in the audience, I would suggest as an example that something like when Lyndon Johnson exited the White House and Richard Nixon won. Many people will say, "Oh, well, that was a sea change, and we went from a liberal Democratic government to a conservative Republican one." I would say it's more like there was a lot of continuity, and that somebody like Richard Nixon essentially finished the Great Society through regulatory means. And when you look at the size, scope, and spending of government, he did a lot to expand it in a way that was similar to what LBJ was doing. Similarly, people often point to a break point between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan from a significant way, and not absolute, but from a significant way. What Carter was actually doing, or rather what Reagan did, was build on a variety of deregulatory measures that Jimmy Carter had done economically and somewhat culturally as well. So there's much more continuity in a more perhaps charged and recent thing. I would say, in many ways, Barack Obama represented the third and fourth term of George W. Bush. He increased spending. He increased the amount of government oversight of various aspects of the economy. He continued various kinds of surveillance programs, as well as a foreign policy that was not particularly distinct from George W. Bush. So we see that. And I would argue that Donald Trump was not as atypical or out of the blue as his defenders and his enemies would like to believe. And I think there's a lot of continuity between what we'll see, what Trump was doing and what Joe Biden was doing. But so this all brings me to the first set of implications of the lockdown. And I want to talk about things that I think are substantially or substantively positive or morally neutral. The main thrust of these is that the lockdown has forced us to actually complete many of the technological innovations that first got underway in the 1990s as the internet, and especially the World Wide Web, which is essentially a function of the internet. It's a subset of the internet developed into a mass medium. And I want to show a short video. I'll also show one about negative sides in a few minutes. I want to show a short video about 5 minutes ago that I produced with some of my colleagues at Reason a year ago at the beginning of the lockdown. And this was, I'll say, just bluntly, this was mostly done as a way to make me and my colleagues, feel a little better about a world where many of us were in California and New York, and we were effectively locked in our houses with very little to do. But here is a short video about the positive sides of the lockdown. We were once told that nothing could replace sitting down with a teacher, the camaraderie of an office, a face-to-face business deal, or seeing a movie in the theater. But when the grim coronavirus pandemic is finally defeated, the question we'll be asking ourselves isn't, why would you want to do that online? But why would you want to do that in real life? For decades, the shimmering potential of what used to be called cyberspace gathered dust in the corner of our living rooms like a fancy, expensive piece of exercise equipment used for draping laundry. In 1990's Life After Television, George Gilder gazed upon networked machines he called telecomputers and dreamed of a world in which political and corporate hierarchies were smashed by user-generated hetarchies. The founders of Wired promised a peaceful digital revolution that would whip through our lives like a Bengali typhoon. The coronavirus has done what 30 years of internet manifestos never accomplished: a mass migration into our screens. We aren't being quarantined in our homes so much as being frog-marched into a virtual fallout shelter. The silver lining is that we may finally realize that life is mostly better in the cloud, where it's possible to learn faster, work better, and generally get what you really want delivered directly to your door and for less money. Ironically, living online gives us more free time in our actual flesh and blood lives. The typical round-trip commute is about an hour, yet just 3.6% of America's labor force currently works at home half-time or more. More than 50% of all employees have a job that could at least partly be done remotely, and 80% say they want to work from home at least part of the time. Now is their chance. Doctor's appointments that last just a few minutes can take weeks to schedule and blow apart entire days. Telemedicine accounted for less than 1% of insurance claims before the pandemic. Now, Medicare is covering video and phone appointments, and hospitals are monitoring coronavirus patients remotely at homes, providing more comfort and reducing the risk of contagion. Before the coronavirus pandemic, fewer than 6% of public K-12 schools offered a majority of their courses online, and just 13% of undergraduates got their bachelor's degrees through the internet. Now the whole country is experiencing the flexibility and offerings available through distance learning, and it seems likely that the future of education will more seriously blend online and in-class instruction. Many people will head out to multiplexes and sports arenas once they reopen, but fewer than ever before. Even before this time of self-isolation, studios had already been stepping up the simultaneous release in theaters and on-demand video. Netflix now allows users to watch the same show remotely with friends, creating a communal experience instead of a solitary one. Amazon is hiring an additional 100,000 workers to meet demand for deliveries of its standard fare and for groceries too, as online retailing explodes. Many will come to see their weekly shopping as the definition of 21st century drudge work, the equivalent of beating carpets or hand-washing clothes. For all the talk about Americans moving back to traditional, densely populated cities, suburbs were already making a comeback, according to Brookings Institution demographer William H. Fry. Suburban and small-town living will become even more attractive as goods and cultural offerings become increasingly dispersed via the internet. This new, accelerated digital revolution won't be lonely or isolating. When it comes to school, work, and socializing, we'll all get to set our own hours and preferences more than ever before, and we'll have more time left over to hang out with family and friends. Virtual and augmented reality gear, faster connection speeds, and the ability to interact with more and different people will give us more points of contact than ever before. Cyberspace, the new home of mind, declared independence from the industrial world decades ago and had been slowly filling up with new arrivals, like the New World did after the first contact with old Europe. The Great Migration has finally begun now, not out of choice but out of necessity. That irony aside, the future awaits us all in whatever terms we choose. Okay, so let me just cancel that. Okay. Um, All right. That is about as utopian a gloss as I'm going to put on something. That video or or op-ed piece is from about a year ago. It was released in early April, and I must say that probably by the time I finished viewing it for the first time when we released it on YouTube, I was like, you know what, that really is not very convincing. And I think in many ways, I would say the past year has both proven it to be true and also tempered my enthusiasm for many elements of that. But I think there's a lot of positive things that will come out of the past year. And most medical experts are predicting we'll reach herd immunity somewhere between this April and the end of the year. And as that happens, well, we assume that life will get more back more or less to a simulation of what it was before the novel coronavirus hit. And we'll start to see pretty quickly which of the things I was talking about there and which of the things we've experienced, including stuff like a Zoom conference that is taken for granted, Zoom meetings, et cetera, which stick around and which will fade. But I'm betting that many of the positive effects will be long lasting. One of the things that is fascinating to me, and I've written and reported a lot on this over the past year, is that not everybody can work from home or work when they want to. Only about if you look at a variety of studies, and there was one in particular from the University of Chicago's Booth School Business School that said, like, at max about 40% of American workers can probably work full time from home. That means that a large majority of people cannot, and people who can't work from home also tend to be in on-demand kind of professions where they can't say, okay, I'll do my work during the night because I'm a night owl or anything like that. So there's real limits to this, but wherever working from home and working on your own time and whatnot is possible, it will continue as it has. It will continue to develop, and it'll probably become systematized already. Large employers of kind of knowledge workers such as Facebook and Google and whatnot have said, we're not expecting anybody to come back for a year or more to any kind of centralized office. um, I think more generally workplaces will be likely to continue to become looser and looser. Again, those of us in the non-traditional college undergrad right now in the room will know that compared to, say, 1970 or 1980 or even 1990, the way you comport yourself and work, the workplace has just become much looser than it has. So again, I want to, suggest that a lot of what we're talking about here is not a complete change or a break with the past, but rather either an acceleration or deceleration of an existing trend. I think entertainment and schooling will become more and more kind of multi-sided and virtual. Certainly entertainment for a long time, and that's not a bad thing for any number of reasons. And schooling will, be online in a big way. Not necessarily in a good way. I mean, and I'll get to that in a bit. But and then the one of the other main things I really do hope happens, and it's a positive one, is just bringing the medical sector into the kind of telecomputer internet revolution 20, 30, 40 years late. I don't know how many of you have actually availed yourself of telemedicine, whether it's for psychological counseling or for regular checkups and quick questions. It's so much better to to be able to do that online or over an app rather than killing a day to refill birth control or get antibiotics for something that a doctor can easily diagnose over the phone. So the other thing that I think we can also point to as a positive trend, and I'll come back to this at the end, is I, as a professional libertarian, which kind of makes me cringe to think of that term. But when the pandemic hit, again, about a year ago, there were a number of places that had headlines, stories that had headlines, something along the lines of "There are no libertarians in a pandemic." You know, suddenly everybody wants a strong centralized government. They want somebody, you know, making order out of chaos and things like that. One of the interesting developments over the past year, which has been good, is that in fact, there were many libertarians in the pandemic. And so, for instance, a lot of rules and regulations that were put into place, mostly for reasons that are always in the name of the common good or the public good or public health, but actually were helping self-interest, went away. The FDA waived a bunch of rules on testing and whatnot after screwing up the rollout of testing and trying to kind of commandeer that. The vaccines that were developed over the past year were essentially partly done by getting rid of a variety of existing regulations and procedures to, you know, to oversee that, which always benefit large existing pharmaceutical companies. The state of Massachusetts, which has particularly onerous restrictions on who can practice medicine there, as it became clear they needed more healthcare workers, they waived a bunch of the rules that were involved. Licensing rules. Licensing rules generally are there. They're always said in they're always put forward in the name of helping the little person who otherwise would be taken advantage of. But they always exist in order to maintain the kind of hegemony of whoever happens to be in power when those rules are being righted. Those were lifted. So hopefully some of those things will also go away, and we'll move more towards a condition that I call permissionless innovation, where the default setting is to allow people to try stuff rather than saying, no, you need permission. So that's some of the positive stuff. And I'm about 20 minutes in. I'm going to go through the negatives that I see. And this is where, I'll be a little bit more forceful here in saying, particularly to the young people who are listening, you have been raised as almost like human veal. You have not been given much freedom, either, I would say, intellectually, ideologically, physically. And I say this as somebody, I have two children, a 27-year-old, I guess he's not a child anymore, and a 19-year-old, also not a child, and I've been writing about changes in kind of adolescence and childhood for most of my professional career, you know, making the most out of that teen magazine background, I suppose. But you have lived in a curated world where your days, and especially if you're at a place like Bard, if you go to any college, you spend many, many more hours than I did. I was born in 1963 in scheduled time with an authority figure in the room, with an adult, with somebody telling you where to go, what to be, how to eat, all of that kind of stuff. You should be particularly annoyed at what was going on in the past year. Again, it's not different than what you're used to. It's a kind of hyper extension or an exaggerated form of it. But what I want to talk about now is the state of emergency as normal governing paradigm. So, as we discuss this, the negative developments during the last year of coronavirus or of the lockdowns, I want to invoke a concept used by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. And I'm mispronouncing his name, and I apologize to him and to my Italian mother for not knowing how to pronounce Italian names, but there it is. As Italy went into the first lockdown in Europe, and one of the harshest on the planet, where people were essentially not allowed to leave home without a police escort or for one of very few particular reasons, Agamben wrote that what is once again manifest here is the growing tendency to use the state of exception as a normal governing paradigm. So what's he mean by the state of exception? Agamben has elaborated a concept introduced by the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt, who was, not surprisingly, a critic of liberal constitutional regimes of Weimar, Germany, and of elsewhere, which he saw as weak, inherently weak and prone to collapse either from without or within. He was, after all, a fascist, a Nazi, liked strong men and strong governance, at least at that point in his life. And the state of exception was an event or development that allowed for normal restrictions on state power to be suspended in the name of the common good, basically martial law. For any number of reasons. It could be for public health, like a pandemic. It could be because of a Reichstag fire. So there's political chaos. It could be in the wake of a natural disaster where lava is flowing in the streets. But there's this idea that that we get called into a state of exception where government or other powerful forces become you get to assume something approaching total control. The Reichstag fire in 1933 Germany is the paradigmatic example for Schmidt and in many ways for Agamben. Because of that arson, President von Hindenburg suspended many constitutional rights, and that was a key step to a Nazi plurality in the legislature becoming, essentially a single party state, totalitarian state. Agamben points to the 9/11 attacks in the United States and throughout Europe or similar as another state of exception in which a number of civil liberties were curtailed or reduced. And why I want to talk about the state of exception or why it's important is that I also want to point out that Agamben, when he's talking about the COVID-19 lockdowns, he's saying that this is the growing tendency to use the state of emergency as a normal governing paradigm. As I said at the start, what we've experienced in the past year is not brand new. It's part of the world we live in, where we lurch from catastrophe to catastrophe, from state of exception to state of exception. We go from 9/11 into the global war on terror, which lasted for a number of years. Then the financial crisis in 2008. At the end of his term in office, George W. Bush said, I support free market capitalism, but I have to suspend it in order to preserve it. It's a state of exception that led into TARP and a variety of major expansions, not just in the amount of money the government was spending, but in what it could control in the economy during the bailout. Then we have the kind of state of exception or the oddness of a Trump victory, which nobody was quite expecting. And now we have COVID-19. Most of the 21st century has been lived either directly or in the very dark shadow of an explicit state of exception. Another way of talking about this is also in a lower grade version of it is that most of the second half of the 20th century after World War II was in a mild version of the state of exception, certainly in the United States, the Cold War, where certain types of things that had been taken for granted were kind of taken off the shelf because we were in a twilight struggle with international communism. And as a result, the state could force certain types of things to happen. They could suspend people's civil liberties because they were presumed to be communist or something else. The state of California, and I'm talking to you from Reason's offices, which were headquartered in LA. We're all over the country as individuals, but the University of California and put in loyalty oaths that were until very recently still in force because of the Cold War, a state of exception. Agamben is also heavily indebted to the social critic Michel Foucault, whose work focused not just on how power operates, but even more specifically in the ways in which systems of control seek to make themselves almost invisible, seeming to be the natural order of things. Foucault was particularly interested in the ways people or institutions that wield power and control often mask themselves in the beneficent language of public health or medical discourse, so that their control is cloaked in what I call helper rhetoric. In this, for those of you who either have an interest in the history of critiques of psychiatry or are libertarians, will recognize a deep similarity between Foucault and Thomas Szasz, the great critic of psychiatry, who also talked about how medicalized discourse takes more and more control out of individual hands by saying this is a disease, you're not a moral agent, so you don't deserve or can't express autonomy. You can't have autonomy. This is a big part of what Agamben is talking about. And I think it's extremely helpful to think of the COVID lockdowns in light of the concept of a state of exception, partly because doing so alerts us to the risk of a lockdown influenced social order becoming a normal governing paradigm, to use his phrase. A year ago, we went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And if you'll remember, that was the charge. And Donald Trump signed on to this, saying, like, we need to stay at home. We need to practice a kind of self enforcing lockdown for a couple of weeks in order to flatten the curve, not necessarily save more people, but reduce the crush on our medical resources, on our healthcare resources, and then we would be able to open up more or less quickly. But instead, we have ongoing lockdowns and controls that are don't just seem arbitrary and unrelated to genuine risk assessment, but actually are arbitrary and unrelated to actual risk assessment. Whatever the intentions, I would argue too, it seems incontestable to me that the actual effects of the lockdown of the past year has been to concentrate power, wealth, and opportunities in fewer hands. Again, I'm talking from California. Somebody like Gavin Newsom was able to change the way business was done overnight and several times, locking down businesses, opening them up, locking them down again in a way that would have been unimaginable without the pretext of COVID. And this past year has been by far the most disruptive period in all of our lives, in all American lives, at least since World War II, when a third of the male population was served in the armed forces, most of whom were drafted. Goods and services were strictly rationed, travel was severely restricted, and the economy was put fully in the service of the war effort. If you have parents or grandparents who fought in World War II or lived through that, talk to them and recover what it was like to not have basic independence in what you could buy, what you could sell, how you could act. We're not there, but we're approaching it. Um, it's hard to say one thing is, let me, okay. I'd say it's hard to say one thing that is most representative of the disruption, but I guess I'll give two broad categories. And the first is the ending of full-time in-person instruction for particularly for K through 12 students, but also for colleges. I'm not sure where BART is on that. My sister is a dean at Notre Dame in Indiana, and they were one of the first colleges to announce last fall that they were going to in-person instruction, come hell or high water. They tried it. They had dorms set up on campus to act as quarantine rooms. They had to go into lockdown. They opened up. They closed down again. They opened up again. My younger son is currently at Chapman University in Southern California, where his mother teaches, and he has not had an in-person class since about last March or April. And it's not clear when that's coming back. For K through 12 students, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, a co-author, Matt Welch, lives in New York, and he has two grammar school age kids, a kindergartner and a kid in grammar school. And they have not been in regular 5-day-a-week school since last spring. And it's not at all clear when they will be going back to something like that. In terms of education, one of the effects of this, most analysts agree that the quality of instruction online is much weaker, and attendance is particularly bad among lower income students, which means we are widening an already large achievement gap. A major knock-on effect of this is that women have been leaving the workplace in greater numbers than men, who have also been exiting, but women are now about 3% below, 3 percentage points below the labor force participation rate that they were before the pandemic, down to about 54% in the workplace. Something like 3 million women have exited the workplace since the pandemic, or since the lockdown a year ago. At the same time, more and more commercial activity has come under strict government regulation, most of which are extremely arbitrary at best. When you think about things like theaters and concert venues are gone, it is not exactly clear if movie theaters, when they will be coming back and anything like they were. Two of the major chains are basically in bankruptcy. I think places like Broadway, I live most of the time in New York City. Broadway may or may not open in, over the summer, in the fall. It's not exactly clear how long that will last or what that will look like. Indoor dining was banned, outdoor dining was banned, then allowed, then banned, then opened again. Um, and this is in various parts. New York and California are still the most locked down places, it's the ability to control one's own destiny, whether you're a business owner or a consumer, is very, it's almost non-existent in a way that was unimaginable a year ago. And there's a larger issue at work here too, which is that the state has flexed in this moment. And we can argue about whether or not it was, it's certainly understandable whether or not it was a good idea or a bad idea. The question is really what happens next. But as I said, I live in New York, and the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo put together a list of essential and non-essential stores. Clothing stores for a long time were ruled non-essential, whereas stores that sold alcohol were considered essential. And we can argue about the list, but the idea of turning over to the state the right to basically say you can be open and you cannot is a state of exception that we should understand, appreciate, and I think highlight, why are these regulations happening and how legitimate are they? And if they are legitimate, how do we minimize the duration of being under such sets of controls? What I want to do now is kind of show a 5-minute video that showcases the arbitrariness of many of these government roles. This is by a colleague of mine at Reason. It is, I think, an interesting way to look at the effect on some small business owners in California.
And we know this.
Oops, hold on. Yeah. Oops. Sorry about that. That's not it. Here we go.
This is trash. It's crippling a sector of our economy that's already limping.
To persecute us as an industry based on 5 or 6 weeks of spiking cases that probably have very little to do with outdoor dining is just crazy.
On November 22nd, Los Angeles became the only county in America to ban outdoor dining this winter for a minimum of 3 weeks. This order could put out of business many California restaurants that were barely hanging on, some of which recently invested in retrofitting for exclusively outdoor dining. The worst part, according to critics, is that the public health agency issuing the order has provided no concrete evidence that outdoor dining is a significant source of COVID spread.
I personally feel like we're being punished.
Kat Turner is a chef and partner at Highly Likely Cafe in the West Adams neighborhood of Los Angeles.
The data to support that COVID is being spread through outdoor dining, I think is extremely flimsy. I just don't understand the agenda that's being pushed.
They've shut us without saying, hey, here's a solution. This is how we're going to help businesses. This is how we're going to help you get through this period, because they knew it was coming, but where's the planning? Where's the foresight?
David Combes is the CEO of Botanical Group, which owns 2 restaurants in West Hollywood, including EP and LP, which shifted all of its business to outdoor rooftop dining.
We've spent a considerable amount of money. Our additional investments being in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, from additional staffing required, security required to manage patrons and make sure there's distancing applied, barriers and sanitizers, health department and visitors to check for compliance. I'm happy to say that we've sailed through with flying colors. It's certainly made our life challenging and profitability an impossibility.
LA County's Department of Public Health issued the order the weekend before Thanksgiving, pointing to a 108% increase in case numbers and rising hospitalizations as rationale for the renewed restrictions.
Gathering with people you do not live with can increase the chances of getting or spreading COVID-19.
LA Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer held an online press conference on November 23rd to discuss the order and estimates from the county's contact tracing that 10 to 15% of COVID transmissions are linked to dining experiences, though she hasn't clarified how many of those transmissions were attributed to outdoor dining at restaurants and declined to provide the underlying data when pressed by reporters.
Has there been a noted outbreak that has come from people dining outside?
People are eating and drinking, and they're not wearing their face coverings for the vast majority of time that they're there. When they're gathered with people who are not in their household, there just ends up being a significant amount of risk associated.
I think the question, and I don't know that you answered it, and she wanted to know a number of outbreaks as a result of restaurants. And
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I will be happy to work with our communications team and we'll get those numbers.
The health department didn't respond to Reason's follow-up requests for those numbers, and the county's online data portal identifies only 16 restaurants as outbreak sites, most of them fast food restaurants involving only employees, not outdoor diners. And restaurants don't make the county's top 5 list of COVID exposure sites. The county's also found that the vast majority of restaurants do comply with its health orders and that cases fell through the summer even as outdoor dining was allowed.
Given that you haven't identified an actual source of an outbreak being in outdoor dining, how do you rationalize the closure and how do you expect to measure whether it actually is accomplishing what you're hoping to accomplish?
We know that places where people are gathering without wearing their face coverings are places where transmission is easiest and most likely. But we will be, as always, we'll watch our data.
The county's had 8 months to get their shit together in relation to contact tracing and also testing. So it feels like we are being disadvantaged by a lack of process from the LA County. And now, for political optics, it's, the requirement for them to do something is, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to shut down restaurants and bars.
I think it's stupid. I think people are still going to want to get together, and now they're going to do it inside at other people's homes instead of meeting outside at a restaurant to have dinner. And now that it's colder outside, they're not going to want to sit in the backyard. They're going to want to sit in the living room.
The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors voted 3-2 to uphold the health department's order. One restaurant owner has already filed suit against the county. Turner says she worries about the unintended consequences of an indefinite shutdown of one of the only relatively safe places that people in Los Angeles can gather.
With the very fabric of our mental health as a community kind of hanging in the wires, and the financial stability of us as a business and the livelihood, the literal survival of my team, gets completely irresponsible to shut down outdoor dining. This is what we have here is good for the community, and it's good for the economy, and it's good for our staff, and we're doing it safely. This is not dangerous.
So, again, just to kind of summarize, COVID has given the state the ability, a pretext or a text, to regulate whole swaths of our lives in a way that was unimaginable a year ago. I mean, in terms of shutting down schools, or at least public schools. Many private schools have actually reopened, and virtually all health experts agree that schools are not likely places of spreading and whatnot, but they've shut that down with massive kind of collateral effects on other parts of our lives, as well as the opening and shutting down of whole businesses and aspects of the economy. Around the globe, thankfully not so much in the US, COVID has also ushered in a new era of government censorship. According to Human Rights Watch, which tracks this sort of thing, at least 83 governments worldwide have used the COVID-19 pandemic to justify violating free speech and peaceful assembly rights. Authorities have attacked, detained, prosecuted, in some cases killed critics, broken up peaceful protests, closed media outlets, enacted vague laws criminalizing speech that they claim threatens public health, which is something to always be thoughtful of. The victims include journalists, activists, healthcare workers, political opposition groups, and others who have criticized government responses to the coronavirus. In the United States, state censorship really hasn't been an issue for a wide variety of reasons, including historic commitments to things like the First Amendment and whatnot, and also the inability of the government to actually control the media which is a good thing. But there's no question that during the past year, social media platforms that function, they're private companies, but they do function as a public square of debate, have been locking down all sorts of speech, especially even especially as they're being called to testify more in front of Congress or in front of the government, which is saying they are thinking about regulating these entities. But they are doing more and more to combat what they consider misinformation about COVID-19, vaccine risks, and the like. And I want to rush to say I wear a mask. I believe in vaccines as a general category, and I believe in the COVID-19 vaccines. And I look forward to getting a vaccine as soon as I can, once I'm in whatever category is allowed for that. But social media platforms are shutting down speech in the name of helping public health. Kind of coincident with this is a debate about Section 230. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it's a law that governs the ability of of websites, of internet service providers, and the like, to moderate comments without necessarily taking on responsibility for the comments they leave behind or for all comments in general. That is going that is going on now broadly through the COVID-19 kind of paradigm of we need to regulate speech more because bad speech is particularly bad now. And then I'll also talk about just in this state of exception and a negative influence or something that's been going on has to do with government spending at basically every level, but especially at the federal level. Last year, the federal government ponied up almost $4 trillion in spending that was somehow directly or somehow claimed to be related to COVID-19 and dealing with the outcome. Much of this in terms of stimulus spending, but also bailouts to specific industries or specific people. There is currently, as we're talking, there's a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill that's working its way through Congress, much of which has nothing to do with COVID, whether you think this is a good thing or not. There, in the current stimulus bill, there is a proposal for a $15 minimum wage and a national minimum wage, which has literally nothing to do with COVID. Many of the things that are happening now, the way that you push through an agenda that pre-existed the lockdown is by saying somehow this has something to do with COVID. On the net result of all of this, I think, has been an acceleration of two sentiments at odds with one another. The first is a kind of step change in a trend that's been going on for at least half a century towards the lack of confidence and trust in institutions, including most aspects of the government, whether you're talking local, state, or federal, but also for business and nonprofit groups such as the Catholic Church or philanthropies and charities like the United Way, both of which have gone through massive scandals in the past few decades and continue to act poorly. But what we have seen over the past year as government and other kind of sources of power have claimed more legitimacy in telling you how to live or limiting what you are allowed to do, we've also seen the kind of exposure of what are sometimes called noble lies. Somebody like Anthony Fauci, who is a major healthcare expert or policymaker in the federal government, has been for going back to the 80s, has been a chief advisor to both Donald Trump and to Joe Biden. Last year talked about how he openly lied about what the efficacy of wearing a mask. He early on in the pandemic, he said, no, you shouldn't wear a mask. That's bad. You shouldn't, it has no effect or it's a negative one. He later admitted that he did that because he was actually worried that there was a shortage of masks available. And rather than be honest with people, he lied to the public. He did something similar with the percentage of people he thought needed to be vaccinated in order to approach herd immunity. This type of thing is bad. This sows when we have a government that is simultaneously, being more powerful and more controlling and dissembles more in open ways. This is not a good thing. And what happens with that um, is that it accelerates a decline in trust and confidence in institutions. We go from being a high trust society to a low trust society. And one of the really weird and seemingly, paradoxical outcomes of that is that low trust societies routinely across the globe will ask the government or people in power to do more to regulate an economy or a culture they know is out of control, even as they know the people they are asking to regulate it or make it right are not trustworthy. And it becomes the opposite of a virtuous cycle. It becomes a vicious cycle where people begin to trust less and less, but ask for more and more controls being placed usually upon their neighbors, but also upon themselves. I think COVID, the lockdown has exacerbated this in all sorts of ways. And whether it is somebody like Anthony Fauci, who aspires to being nonpartisan or trans, beyond partisanship, expert and openly lying to people, or then you have people like Donald Trump, who in endless bad faith arguments was talking about various things, in a way that just sowed more distrust. So among the other things that we see are the unparalleled increases in peacetime government spending. And this brings me back to that idea of the state of emergency. Government spending and interventions tend to have a logic of their own where they far outstrip or outlast the situation that inspires or underwrites them. There's every reason to believe that many of the regulations and rules, many of the kind of mental constructs that have been put into place, and certainly the permanently heightened spending levels that arose out of COVID will be with us for a long time to come. Those of us, again, I'm calling out to the older people in the room, you can remember a period before 9/11 or before the Transportation Security Administration and after. And the events and the kind of activity that the TSA was specifically created to address, most of those were solved the minute that they hardened cockpit doors on airplanes. There has not been a commandeering of an airliner since then, but we are still basically enthralled to the same sets of regulations and restrictions that went into place in 2002. What the COVID lockdown, I think, has done is create a model for a totalizing lockdown of society in the name of public health. Even before COVID, and this should be worrying, if we take as the measure of if a pretext for legitimate government action is public health, we need to think about all of the other ways in which something like what we've seen in the past year can be extended for other circumstances. If we believe that racism is a public health issue, and I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, I'm saying if you talk about it in terms of public health, if you talk about global warming or climate change as a public health phenomenon, and groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists and a wide variety of other people say it is, we have just gone through a kind of demonstration project of how public health can be used to radically restructure and minimize individual autonomy, freedom of speech, all sorts of activity in the name of public health. So, and I will try and wrap up quickly. I guess I'm going closer to the hour that I was supposed to, rather than the one that I hoped to. But and then we can get to questions. I'd like to suggest some basic ways to push back against attempts to extend this state of emergency that Giorgio Agamben identifies, and I think that we all do to some degree or another. What are ways that we make sure this is a temporary state of emergency rather than a new normal or a permanent paradigm of governance? The first is to recognize that we are, in fact, in an emergency, and we need to deeply acknowledge at all times that whatever measures are put in place need to be temporary. There is a difference between, World War II and peacetime. And that was easier seen than a lot of the things that are going on now. Wars end, pandemics end, economic depressions end. Our focus should be on getting back to normal as soon as possible. And when I say getting back to normal, I don't mean a nostalgic vision of wasn't January of 2020 was such a great time. We need to get back to that, much less making America great again, in whatever fever dream we might have of that, but of lifting of all special measures that have constrained our behaviors. They should at the very least be sunsetted, if not lifted immediately as possible. Second, we should always be working to devolve decision making to the level where it is where there is the most information and the most impact, and where the actors have the most ability to change outcomes. There's an example of this would be to rather than telling everybody certain businesses are essential and others are non-essential, and hence you can have this business be open but not this one. If the issue is the risk of the people who are actually either running the shops or shopping at the shops, it would be much better to give good information on the risk levels that are out there, and then let individual businesses and shoppers decide whether or not they want to go out to this kind of business or not. There's no reason that clothing stores should have been barred from opening in New York if liquor stores were open. Give people the information to make choices and their own level of risk assessment. With something like schooling, we have seen now we're in, throughout the country, particularly in large school districts, there is a concerted effort on the part of teachers and teachers unions not to reopen schools, even though there is broad agreement that schools are not places where people are likely to be infected, either children or the staff themselves. As a result of the closures, there's a massive increase in school choice, in various types of school choice. The best kind of school education policy is simply to give individual parents and students, when it makes sense, the ability to take their school dollars with them. They are the ones making the decision. They are the ones who are bearing most of the responsibility or the outcomes of a good or bad education. Let them decide. Same with stimulus checks. If we're going to have more and more stimulus spending, instead of giving it to favored special interests, to corporations or industries or politically connected people, give it to individuals and allow them to control where it gets spent. And then finally, I think we need to commit or recommit to related ideals of true pluralism, of recognizing that we have radically different ways of living in the world, and that we should allow as many of us as possible to live however we want. Central to this ultimately is an embrace of free speech and free expression that also extends to commercial activity, I think, in a meaningful way, where we are okay with disagreement and argument rather than attempting always to regulate and shut down speech that we don't like or that we find offensive or misinformed. We should also, in a related way, reinvigorate the idea of permissionless innovation, or at least of innovation on some level, of going from a society in which the top of the pyramid, whether we're talking about a few businesses that get to set the marketplace in the ways that they want, or politicians or culture leaders, but in which the top of the pyramid calls the shots. We need to move away from that and into an embrace of a distributed network of individual actors and the groups and the subgroups that they form, and give them not only I don't want to say permission, they should have the ability to act as they want, but give them the tools and the resources to do so. So I will stop there. And maybe we can have some questions about this. And I guess to go back to my earlier comments, invidious as they may have been or as insulting to the younger people, think about the world that you're growing up in. In many ways, I wrote a piece for Reason over, almost 25 years ago, talking about the ways in which we had kind of child-proofed the world. For people your age, as you were growing up, people who are younger now, We have tried to take all of the sharp edges off of the world. That's a good thing. It's a sign of a wealthy society. It's a sign of a society that cares about young people. But it leads to a world which is not that different from the extreme version of it we see today, where somebody else is telling you how to live, what is a good life, what is a bad life, what you are allowed to say or not. I think it's time to push back against that, not just when it comes to things like the COVID-19 lockdown, but when something approaching normalcy returns. We need to have a more robust society, and one that is less kind of consumed with minimizing harms, and I think instead maximizing the ability of people to figure out what kind of life they want to live, what kind of world they want to build, and how to go about doing it. So I will stop there for now.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So now we can start asking some questions. And if any students have questions or comments, you can raise your hand or you can drop the questions in the chat. And I thought I would just start us off maybe. I have a question about the continuity of our political lives that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And that there has not actually been a lot of change in our society as much change as we may perceive to there have been. And I'm wondering if you think there is some kind of catastrophe or emergency that would permit a greater change to happen in our political lives that has not happened yet.
That's it's a good question. And, my short answer is to say, I hope not. And let me just get it. I certainly hope not. I mean, something like an asteroid hitting the Earth, or something like that, or some kind of catastrophic environmental event, a series of volcanoes going off, a global war. One of the things that is good, and I am, kind of a techno optimist. One of the people in the comment section has said I'm talking a lot about technology. I wouldn't quite say I'm a technological determinist, but I am a techno optimist. And what has been going on for, the past 500 years, at least, and certainly, for most of the second half of the 20th century, I would say, has been a rise of technology that has allowed more people, just simply put, more people to live on the planet, more people to have food, more people to develop connections with one another. The general direction of the world is pretty good. Especially when you look to the developing world, what used to be called the third world, the number of people living in poverty, the number of people who are subject to the absolute whims of either nature or a government or some other force of power, those have been minimized. We have a long way to go. But I don't think the problem is with the broad direction that we're going in, which is that people have more opportunities to actualize however they want. The question is, how do we increase the velocity of that? Because I say this as somebody who was all of my grandparents were born in Europe. They were born in Ireland and Italy, and they all moved here in the mid 19-teens. Their lives compared to mine were miserable. My life compared to my children's, I think they will look back on it and see it as a bad thing. I'm not a blind believer in progress, but things are getting better as the world gets richer and individuals have more chances and options to decide how they want to live. How do we get there faster is the real question.
Okay, it looks like Professor Hill has a question. If you want to.
Hi, thanks for
Hi.
I have two questions. They're both brief. The first question is, I was hoping you would maybe just say a few things about Twitter and Facebook's regulation of Donald Trump in the final days of his presidency, and what the future of regulatory efforts to control big tech platforms might look like in the future. And then the second question, I think I was following most of kind of what you were laying down, and I generally agree with being very concerned about the ways in which the state of exception is being continuously used to expand the federal government, especially since 9/11. But the part where you caught me was when you said, like a good minimum wage doesn't have anything to do with COVID. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we need to, I think that does in a very explicit way. And I really worry about the way in which labor is devalued
Okay.
in the United States, and the lack of respect that we have for people doing the kind of hard work that's necessary to keep our everyday lives resembling something,
Yeah.
intact.
So for the first question about the kind of regulation of social media, this is where I think a traditional libertarian paradigm, which makes a very clear distinction between, kind of private action and state action or public action, needs to, needs to evolve into a kind of more complicated understanding of where we are. And I say this as somebody, I am a very dogmatic libertarian, but places like Twitter and Facebook are private platforms, and they should. I think they have absolute right to kick off whoever they want, whatever. But I think many of their actual decisions and the world that is starting to emerge, partly because of a threat of regulation, also partly because these platforms want to be regulated because it frees them up. They are already bigger and they're ensconced, so they can deal with regulation. They will help write the regulation in a way that will actually minimize competition. That's an insight of public choice economics, as well as various historians such as Gabriel Kolko, the socialist historian of progressivism, critic, pointed out that the railroads actually wanted to be regulated. It was not something foisted on them. Something similar is going on with social media. I do worry about it. I think it was outrageous at various points when public figures are being shut down on kind of social media, even if they have the right to do that. I would much rather live in a world, and this isn't something that you legislate, but it's a culture that you build. I think it's much better. And I think the real promise of social media is that you give individual users the ability to create the experience they want. And people can argue that that would lead to bubbles, but we already have bubbles. And if it's a self created bubble, I find that preferable to one where either Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg or a bunch of mid-level people at these platforms are deciding what I can and cannot stand or see and things like that. I'm deeply worried about the actual government regulation of media. We For those of us who came of age in the late 20th century, we didn't realize, many of the times we didn't realize it, or I didn't, that we only had this truly robust free speech in America. I would argue from maybe the late 50s until now. I was born in a world where it was, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Ulysses, Tropic of Cancer, dirty books could only have been published recently, starting in the late 50s and early 60s. And we take for granted that historical moment for like a longstanding principle. The government, people like Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, right-wing conservative Republicans want to regulate social media. So do left-wing progressives like Elizabeth Warren. That should be very troubling to all of us. And I don't know, other than pointing out that free speech is better. That's a battleground. The second question about the minimum wage. Let me, to forestall an argument about whether or not having a national minimum wage is the best way to show that we care about labor or not. And also the economic arguments about whether or not a minimum wage, I think one of, and there's an ongoing debate about this, and social science is nothing if not imprecise in the data that it can bring, to any of these arguments. But, a serious question is, does the benefit to the people who receive the higher minimum wage, is that more of a benefit than for whatever unit of people or percentage of people who get priced out of the labor market altogether? That's a question that I'd be happy to talk about at length. What I'm saying though is I think when you are talking about a COVID specific bill where you are trying to deal with the effects of COVID, and you say this is a great time to have a $15 minimum wage, that strikes me as an odd thing, because it is also it's not a limited emergency measure. It's not a bailout. It's not a handout. It's not a relief check. It is something that will exist for years and years to come. I would be much more comfortable with the idea of, if what we need to do is to help people who are hurting because of the lockdown, let's give them direct aid rather than starting to create a lot of costs on businesses that may or may not be coming back when the lockdown is lifted.
Okay, there's some questions in the chat. So Jeffrey Singer says, Nick, please talk about the Ratchet Effect and how public health officials might remain major players in social control in post-pandemic America.
Yeah, so there's this concept of the ratchet effect that mostly has to do with the size, scope, and spending of government, particularly the federal government, that an economist and historian named Robert Higgs put together or articulated in a book called Crisis and Leviathan. And the idea is that whenever there is a crisis, and it could be a war, the Civil War, say World War II, or the Great Depression, it could be something like that, that typically what happens is that the government expands. It expands its size, its spending, and the scope of what it is controlling. And that when the cause, or when that event goes away, the Civil War ends, World War II ends, the Depression ends, there's a ratchet effect where spending and size and scope goes up, but then it doesn't come back down to where it was before. And I think what Jeff Singer, who is somebody I know, who is a wonderful, he's a surgeon as well as a policy analyst who is affiliated with the Cato Institute. When he's talking about the ratchet effect in terms of healthcare or public health, I think that's an interesting question of where at various moments when there are public health pandemics, and it could be something like the Spanish flu epidemic, it could be like polio, it could be like the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, that public health measures, they become stronger. Public health experts are needed in certain circumstances, but then the public health administration or the powers that were vested in people in order to deal with a particular problem don't necessarily go away. And I think that that's a real, it's a concern. And this is something, I think about people like Foucault or Agamben. They're on the left, but there's a libertarian dimension to them, which pairs up with, the kind of tradition I'm coming out of, is that it's very seductive and it's very logical. And oftentimes it's very convincing to say, there are some experts who should be kind of creating the limits of what is acceptable behavior because they know better. That kind of model, gets empowered during a crisis like this, and then it doesn't go away. And that should be disturbing to all of us, especially as the conditions that generate the need start to fade away.
Okay, looks like Rob has a question. If you want to ask a question.
Yes, thanks for this talk. I found it really interesting. I just want to talk about, I guess, the COVID kind of who is the authority or making the decisions, who ought to be, I guess. If we think if it was theoretically possible to make a set of decisions to minimize the spread. I mean, I guess the goal is to achieve community spread that's like less than like 1.0, so that it decreases over time.
Right.
And we've determined that the government, at least in its current state, is not able to make those decisions. What I kind of garnered from, or what I kind of understood from your talk, is that we should give kind of more power back to the individual, where I think you said you should give more evidence to restaurants so they can make the decisions. And in the video, you have one person who owns a business saying, this it's not dangerous here.
Right.
I guess my question is, should we I guess give people that power, because they're not scientists, they're not experts in this. Even, I mean, if my family, for example, if I gave them a paper showing them this is kind of what we've learned about COVID, they're not very afraid of COVID at all, and they're kind of less wearing masks than other people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, what is the alternative? I agree the government didn't do a good job, but I also think that if we let people do what they do, I think it would actually probably be worse.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting question, and I guess part of it is who's we, in these or who's society, and what is a better outcome? Is a better outcome, certainly we don't want people who don't want to get COVID or an infectious disease to get it, right? By the same token, if you cannot, in the end, if you can't trust individuals to make meaningful decisions about their lives, what kind of society do we have? And that's very abstract, but I think a one of the things in that video, which is particularly telling, is that even according to the Los Angeles or to California's Board of Health, outdoor dining was not a threat, was not a risk. It was not a particularly bad place, for things to be happening. So there is this sense of saying we're going to follow the science, except when we don't, and then we're going to overstate our game or whatever. So I think, and I don't expect this to be particularly satisfying to you or for you, but it would be better. We did not have questions about leaving grocery stores open. People also acted pretty reasonably in grocery stores. Every grocery store I went to, people masked up. The people working at grocery stores did not come down in massive cases with, with COVID and things like that. I think it would have been better, certainly in this case, to have said, here are the transmission rates, here are the ways to minimize transmission. If you are this old, here is the likelihood that you will get infected. If infected, this is the likelihood that you will die. And understanding that this is an evolving process and a bunch of social practices that are going to happen, I think that is always preferable to saying there is one way to do it. We're going to insist on it now. We're going to make you do that. And then 2 weeks later or 2 months later, we're going to reverse because we didn't know what we were doing. So I think in the end, it is not a utopian, kind of way of talking about things, but you have to trust to people and give them autonomy, I think, except in very, very rare circumstances.
Okay, it looks like we have another question in the chat from Anthony Heinor. Says, Nick, can you speak to the affinities and alignments existing between the expansion of state power on the one hand and particular interests and constituencies in society, big tech, teachers unions on the other?
Yeah, one of the things that is helpful if you're not if one, as I do, if you don't define yourself as a partisan, in your like top three characteristics or something like that, you start to see things in a different way, which in many ways is a darker vision of how things happen, but I think it's also a clearer one. And what we see is that we're kind of taught a rhetoric of the state is, depending on, and you can, is either the good guy or the bad guy, and they will expand to help the little guy, say, from a kind of populist progressive perspective. The idea is that there are rapacious corporations or other interests that just have, almost complete control over a marketplace and hence over our lives, both as workers and as consumers. Government expands and it helps us. It's a countervailing power against that sort of thing. You can reverse those sides and say, well, business is the only thing that keeps government in check. When you look at it from, and oftentimes this tracks with being a liberal or a conservative, being a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. But when you start to look at the ways in which things start to line up, it's fascinating. Going back to about 2018 in particular, social media platforms were starting to talk about, and other people in the tech space, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, talked about how, in the tech industry, and this was as Apple was approaching, what, $1 trillion valuation. He said, clearly the free market isn't working anymore. It's time for the tech sector to be regulated. He is not doing that out of, civic virtue. He was doing it at a time when Apple's Apple's profits were kind of flattening a bit. They had basically gotten everywhere they were going to do. He's Alexander the Great, having conquered the world. What he wanted to do is kind of lock in his position. Something similar is going on, I think, with groups like Facebook and Twitter. A couple of years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was actually, a bunch of tech CEOs were called to congressional hearings about various things. Mark Zuckerberg openly said in congressional hearings, we will help you write the regulations to rein in a group, a company like Facebook, because we know the industry and you guys don't. You don't know, and he wasn't saying it in a kind of dickish way. It was matter of fact. And he was saying, of course, this means there won't be any more Facebooks because they're going to write the regulations to kind of freeze the marketplace as it is. That's what always happens. And Congress was like, yeah, we understand that. We're fine with that. This is the great insight of public choice economics, which is not only a libertarian thing, as I was saying before. Many progressive socialists talk about it. Somebody like Gabriel Kolko, I highly recommend reading his stuff. But public choice economics is the catchphrase was, it's politics without romance. And what it does is it shows that people in the public arena or public sector act like people in the private sector, and they're always trying to maximize their market share to lock in their profits. And you will find no end of people who are businessmen who will talk about being for free enterprise and how market competition is the great engine of innovation and this and that. And they will go begging to Congress in order to lock in a system where they happen to be in a very good position. So I think you see that a lot. And this is one of the things that's truly worrying about the current moment, is that pharmaceutical companies, big tech companies, any number of other groups, we had seen this before, with auto manufacturers and whatnot. They go to the government and say, yes, in the name of, common needs and common outcomes, let's regulate more heavily. That's a bad sign.
Looks like Laura Ford has a question.
Thank you so much for your talk and presentation. It's been very, very interesting to listen to you. I want to ask a question about, I guess we could say, the social conditions of possibility for a more libertarian society. I've been reading some of the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the founding period of the United States. And it strikes me that the classical liberals, who you referenced at the beginning of your talk, didn't think that liberty was something that was easy to sustain. They thought that it required virtue, training, it's hard. So, and I guess I've heard from your talk a lot of things that we should do, but I haven't heard very much from you about how you think we can get there as a society. So I'm hoping that you could say a little bit more about how we make the transition to a society that facilitates greater levels of autonomy.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting question. And I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to, say, a book like The Coddling of the American Mind, which came out a few years ago by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. Where there's a kind of psychology of freedom, or a psychology of liberty, let's say, where if you give people a lot of choices in their life, certain types of people are going to do better at maximizing the choice, or taking it seriously and making I want to say better decisions based on what they want, like what do they want to accomplish and achieve. And I think you're right to point to the idea that we need in any society, you need institutions, including things like education, that actually kind of help cultivate the people who will do well under a certain circumstance. And I think part of the problem, or many of the issues that we have in contemporary society, is that on the one hand, we have a vast amount of liberty and autonomy to kind of live however we want, almost at every level of income. Obviously, it gets easier and wider ranging the richer you are and the more socially powerful you are. But even at poor levels, people are so much freer now to choose what kind of culture they consume, to choose whether or what religion they participate in, what their, who they can marry, what they can eat, what kinds of intoxicants they can have. We have much, much more freedom. My basic sense is, because I don't believe there is one single way to that, I think that we develop those institutions mostly by allowing a lot of different models of parenting to evolve and to flourish or die or wither. And then we all learn from other people's experiments that are successful or that fail. I think one of the things that government often does, and in the K through 12 system, which I think is one of the primary places where we could have a higher quality of education, both in terms of I'm less interested in particular skills or whether a kid graduates high school knowing how to use, I don't know, Adobe Photoshop, and more have they learned the kind of principles or dynamics of how do you find out something? How do you learn a new skill? How do you synthesize things that you already know into emerging fields and things like that? I think devolving as many of these decisions in these institutions into smaller units, getting rid of big school districts and having many more school districts, for example, or giving individuals the ability to find the schools that they find are powerful. I think that's helpful. I think having different types of businesses, things like that. And again, I guess, I'm simultaneously very kind of techno utopian on a certain level, and I'm very I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I don't know that there are specific models that you can say other than like let 1,000 flowers bloom in everything, and people will find paths to better outcomes, especially when it comes to maximizing and increasing the choices that they have in their lives.
Okay, we have another question in the chat from Karen Sullivan, who asks, I'm wondering about your thoughts regarding religion and freedom. I'm thinking especially about the Hasidim in New York and Israel. On the one hand, many of the Hasidim feel that there is nothing more important than the practice of their religion and their culture, even if many of them are dying of the coronavirus. On the other hand, other people feel that the Hasidim are spreading the virus in a way that imperils everyone, including those outside their community. How can you balance respect for one group's practice of their religion and public health in and outside that group?
Yeah, that's these are like the hard cases. There are, from a numerical point of view, there's effectively zero Hasidic Jews in America, right? Which is an overstatement, but it's such a small percentage of the population. But it really highlights the issue, particularly in a country like America that has freedom of freedom of religion, or more precisely, freedom from a state religion, and freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and in the first right that is articulated in the Bill of Rights and things like that. As I said at the beginning, I'm not an anarchist, so I don't think, I think that the state does play a role in controlling infectious diseases. And I think there are times where the state can put certain limits on things or make it very hard to have exceptions to general rules, even when it interferes with the practice of religion. And it's not clear that, the practice of religion and, certain types of COVID protocols are totally at loggerheads. I think in general, you let the Hasidics, you let any minority do what they want, as long as they are not imperiling others. When you start to look at the actual numbers of people, like this is not polio. This is not even, the Spanish flu in terms of the contagious effects, or smallpox, or things like that. And I think it is wiser to allow more people to practice even, what I would consider ridiculously unsafe practices as possible, and then try to build in firewalls so that people who do not want to be infected against their will, are not. And I think the one thing that is good, this comes up a lot in cases about measles vaccines and things like that. Generally speaking, this is few and far between. And for whatever else we can say about coronavirus, is that Hasidic Jews are not a major super spreader event outside of Hasidic communities. And if they opt into that, I don't agree with that choice, but more power to them.
Okay, I accidentally skipped a question in the chat from Midori Barandiaran, who says, in terms of free speech, how do we as a society create space for that if institutions increasingly censor speech and regulate the use of language?
There are two ways, and one of the kind of thinkers who has influenced me a lot is a political economist called Albert Hirschman. I mean, he's dead now, but in 1970 or 71, he wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which was specifically took on the test. It's a slim book. Everybody should read it, I think. It's wonderful and really kind of mind-blowing. But it's it's about how do you deal with firms, business firms, with states, with nations, with other groups that are in decline. How do you try to either fix them or get out of them? And he said there are basically three ways to do things. There's exit, voice, and loyalty. And exit is that you just leave and you start your own colony or you start your own company. You are annoyed at something like in Silicon Valley, there's a famous case study of Fairchild Semiconductors run by William Shockley, who helped invent the transistor, but was, just a freaking idiot, a terrible person to work with. He basically, a bunch of people who worked for him who were all really smart were like, screw it, we're starting our own companies. And half a dozen major firms that kind of still define Silicon Valley were found. Another way is through voice, which means that whether you're within a company or within a platform or within a country, you lobby for reform using the available methods that are built in constitutionally, or you create a groundswell of support to change the way things are to a better world. That's something, Martin Luther King did that in a kind of obvious and spectacular way. And then there's loyalty, which is that you just kind of become a company man or a mindless patriot, and you just eat whatever is shoved down your throat. I think it is a serious question. When again, Twitter, Facebook, etc., they have, I think, basically an absolute right to kick off or to limit whoever they want. But I think it's really important for those of us who believe in a culture of free speech, and more importantly, a kind of liberal culture of disagreement and kind of common conversation in order to get to better places. I think we have to be strong on places like Twitter and Facebook and others, and to politicians who want to regulate them in the name of getting rid of things like hate speech or whatever, misinformation or disinformation, to say, no, you know what, we believe that it's better when more people are talking and they're talking more freely. Give us the tools so that we can have an experience that we want, but let us argue amongst ourselves and we'll come to a better conclusion. And sometimes that means breaking off and starting your own thing. Twitter, it's a little bit more than, it's a dozen or so years old, a little bit more than that. What a great supplemental space that didn't exist before. It helped usher in, or, it helped, by most accounts, it helped support the Arab Spring when that was a thing. Without it, it allowed people to connect and to talk and communicate in ways that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Twitter has been used by Hong Kong protesters. Other things like Signal and Telegram and other kinds of encrypted messaging apps have been used to do this. They didn't exist before. They exist now. They expand the possibilities of things. We'll keep creating them. People will keep exiting the existing systems and creating new and better ones, or ones that don't work and they die, like certain colonies died. People showed up at Roanoke, Virginia, and then they disappeared, right? But it's these two, I think the twin things of the twin dynamics of exit and voice are really important. And I think when it comes to free speech, I don't like the idea of a tipping point, because I think everything is much more of a gradient, that is constantly, we're always on a spectrum rather than falling off of cliffs. But we're coming close to a world in which the forces that want to centralize power, that want to centralize speech and expression, are gaining ground. Compared to 20 years ago, much less 50 years ago, we have so much self-expression and so much free speech. It's hilarious to even worry about it, but we should be. And so I think, a combination of exit and loyalty, exit and voice are the way to go.
Okay, looks like we have a final question from Roger.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Nick. This has been fascinating. I want to follow up on a couple of questions that have been asked that I thought, well, I think your answers didn't go as far enough to satisfy me, and specifically Laura's question about virtue. So she's been reading the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. Great. You look at John Locke's diaries, and he writes in code because he doesn't want people to know what he's thinking, and he basically says that we have to educate people, so that they are good liberal citizens, because not everyone can have liberalism. And John Stuart Mill says people in India aren't ready to be liberal citizens. There's a foundation to liberalism, a classical liberalism, that says that it's not for everybody. It's for those who are educated into the virtue of it. Or as Aristotle said, first you have virtue before you can have a constitutional government.
Right.
And it does strike me that I'm a big supporter of a classical liberal world in many ways. Yeah. I believe in letting 1,000 flowers bloom and talking. But if you don't have a public sphere where people listen to each other and can talk and know how to engage with each other, you have everyone with a platform saying whatever they want, and you have massive lying, and you have a complete, breakdown of society. And so it strikes me that a libertarian or a liberal can't evade the question of how do we teach virtue? How do we bring virtue in some way back into, whether you're going to talk about civic virtue or civics or whatever? I don't think you can just ignore it. And if you're going to say, well, we don't want that to come from the top down, well, how are you going to generate it?
Right. I think I am more of a latitudinarian than a lot of libertarians or a lot of liberals are, in that I think often when we talk about the breakdown of civic virtue, and this is a great actual topic, and push me down the stairs on this one too, especially in the wake of the January 6th riot, where we had a bunch of idiots actually storming the Capitol in a way that I guess hadn't happened since the War of 1812 or something like that. We had something approaching a breakdown of the social order. Over the past year during the summer, we had protests, which I think, for Black Lives Matter, which everybody kind of understands protest marches and things like that. But then we also had a bunch of riots, another kind of breakdown in social order and whatnot. My sense of things is that I really cannot think that there is a single type of virtue that is even right for liberalism. And when I read John Stuart Mill, and he talks about how, Indians, South Asians are not ready for freedom yet. And I think about it also, again, my ancestors in Ireland up through, basically the early 20th century, they weren't ready for liberalism yet, or for self-rule or home rule yet, because the people who oftentimes were espousing liberal and libertarian values, which ultimately led to a better world and a freer world, didn't think they were up to the task. Or people living in ghettos in New York in the 20s and 30s, the immigrants and things like that. I think that is always the fact that those of us who believe in certain things are worried that other people won't be able to handle freedom, handle individual autonomy, etc. I'm not scanting the fact that I think everybody should be an intense critical reader and consumer of information. And I think
how do you get there?
Yeah, I think there are certain ways to do it, One is by doing things that Bard College does. One is doing the things that I do at Reason and my colleagues do at Reason, which is that we create and we critique and we participate in critical discourse about information. I also think, though, and this is, I hope it's not as Panglossian or as stupid as it sounds as I'm thinking about it, but most people are actually really good at figuring out what they want and how to get there. Um, on some level, and it's not that they do it by themselves, but they will avail themselves of the tools and of the networks and the resources that they need. What we can do, and this is kind of a libertarian heresy, I think, how do we help people participate more fully in a society who don't come, who are not just to the manor born, but don't come from a solid, say, middle class background where they understand there is a system that you can work. If I may, years ago, I interviewed Richard Rodriguez, the essayist and thinker, who's just a phenomenal character, and he was talking about how he had been in LA and he was talking to some young Hispanic kids who kept talking to him, or he was talking about going somewhere, and they said, "Oh, well, you should go up to UCLA and then go over." And he was like, "UCLA? What do you mean?" And these were kids who he said were living literally within a couple miles of UCLA, but they were so out of the system, they didn't read it as UCLA, and they didn't understand that it was a college, and it was a college that they might actually be able to go to. And if they went to, and that's a fantastic kind of shorthand of like what you're talking about. How do we make sure more people are kind of conscious of all of the options and opportunities? I do think one of the things that the state can do, or something like the state, it can give resources to people who don't have resources. Not a guaranteed, not a universal basic income, because I don't need a universal basic income. I make more than enough money. But poor people should be given resources that allow them to figure out how to, to become whatever they want to become, and that they can. So that's a kind of roundabout way. I think it's happening all around us, Roger. I think this happens in churches. I think it happens in schools, both some public schools, but a lot of private schools and a lot of philanthropies. I think it happens in corporations. I think it happens in media. And this is going back probably when I was more optimistic because I was younger, but I wrote a piece for Reason around 1998 or 99 about how the move from a kind of relatively information starved cultural world of three channels, and of only of radio stations, AM and FM, et cetera, and the explosion that happened with the internet, with all sorts of just technology becoming cheaper. You could suddenly produce and consume culture however you wanted. The internet and the World Wide Web was a huge source of this. And almost by default, having all of that coming at you, people became better consumers of media because they had to be. And and I think that happens. I really do. And where I think the only way that I quibble with you is that I'm actually a true believer in the idea that your virtue and my virtue, which I suspect are very, very similar, they overlap whatever, political commitments we might have that put us on opposite sides of the barricade. We're mostly thinking, this is a good way to be educated. This is a good way to be a citizen. That's not the only way. And I think most of our people are getting there. But I do wish we had more public conversations and more discussion about the values of what we're talking about here is liberalism, a society that tries to allow as many different ways of living, ways of being, of foregrounding the construction of community, of meaning, of identity. And in many ways, I think we're in that world now, and it keeps getting better. But there are always there are always forces, sometimes from the right, sometimes from the left, sometimes from commercial interests, sometimes from the state, that want to limit that. And we just need to constantly be having this discussion and expanding it, and then giving people the tool, not just the tools, but the resources by which they can go. The greatest thing we could do if we want to, I think, create a truly more free society, even if it doesn't end up following the politics or policies I want, is to give, everybody in America, more access to whatever school they want to go to. And we could do that.
What if they don't want to go to school? I mean,
yeah, that's also good.
And
I mean, yeah, and this
agree
is
with you.
where like I said, I'm a kind of triumphalist.
I agree with you.
Attitudinarian.
I agree with you. I don't think they all should go to school.
Yeah,
but I do think that if people, for most of the history of liberal democracy, 20% of the people governed.
Right.
Now and you have in the last 100 years since the National Socialist Party, the Bolshevist Party, since populisms, you have more and more. You have fewer gatekeepers.
Right.
You have the opportunities for what Hannah Arendt called the alliance between the mob and the intellectuals, the mob and the elite, and it's increasingly clear, I think, that those kind of situations are very unstable.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to accept certain instability. I agree with you, but isn't there some, the fact that people can go around and talk about how there's the election was stolen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how does a libertarian deal with that when it's not working, when 40% of the country still doesn't believe it?
Oh, I just read a survey from Suffolk University of Trump voters, and it was something like 71 or 72% of Trump voters don't think that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. And I understand, like, I didn't want Trump to win. I didn't want Biden to win, but he won. What you can do in that case, or from a libertarian point of view, I think, two points. One is that you want to create a world in which the larger agreement is that nobody gets to have that much control over other people. So you really work to constantly build a true liberal order, meaning that the government is limited, all sources of power that are coercive or that can force their will are limited. And that's the idea of why you have an economic marketplace, is because it actually constrains monopoly actors. You have a government that is constrained so that people can disagree, but they can't force other people to do things. And you're constantly rebuilding those walls because they're constantly being broached and people are trying to expand what they can control and whatnot. A second question is, are we dangerously closer to a kind of mob rule that would approximate the horrors of collectivism that we saw in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, a version of which is different and probably better for the people living under it in China and things like that. And I think it's a legitimate question. I'm not happy with political discourse. I'm not happy with the way I see politics going. But I also don't see it as necessarily getting darker and darker. In many profound ways, individuals have more ability in an era of mob rule and increasing mob rule, it seems. They're more able to, eat what they want, smoke what they want, marry whom they want, and live how they want. And that's something that we need to constantly be pushing towards. You say, how do I deal with living in a world where people believe objectively stupid, untrue things? I take a lot of drugs. I recommend that. I wouldn't enforce that, but it's what you do is you evangelize your version of the truth. I should add, I am one of the few people who are in the libertarian world who, objective or not objectively, but I foreground that I'm a postmodernist. I have incredulity toward meta narratives. I think most of us do. And what we do is that, we interact with people, we engage with people, and we try to show the value of my world, the world I'm living in, the version of a world I'm living in, the vision of that world, and try and get more people to either agree with that or not kill me because it doesn't agree with them. That's all we can do. Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, we go through cycles of centralization and decentralization in every aspect of our lives. I think we might be entering one of centralization after a spasm of decentralization, after the Cold War and before the lockdown of social media, which is beginning, or a technological lockdown, which people are trying to affect. But you keep pushing through. I don't know. I'm sorry. It is such a unconvincing issue, but you live your life. You tell people what I believe in visible industry. I guess Ben Franklin's concept that you live openly and kind of semi-transparently, and you create people who either respect that or join you or learn from your mistakes and build something better, and then you learn from them.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it looks like we are at the end of our talk. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. And thank you so much, Nick. That was such a wonderful talk and a great discussion.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I really appreciate the time that you all took to be with me.